My name is Patricia Moore, and I was 36 years old the day I found out my parents had left me nothing. Not a mention, not a memento, not a dime. I was sitting in a beige-carpeted law office that still smelled faintly of stale cigars, surrounded by my siblings, when the will was read aloud in flat legalese that made everything sound clinical. When the attorney reached the end and hadn't uttered my name once, I thought surely he'd made a mistake. Surely there was an addendum or a second page. But he simply folded the papers, smoothed his tie, and thanked us for our time. I sat there in stunned silence as my older brother Nathan leaned back in his chair with a self-satisfied smirk, and my younger sister Dana stared down at her polished nails, pretending not to see the devastation blooming across my face. If you've ever sacrificed years of your life for someone, only to be erased from the final chapter, you know that feeling, like your insides have been scooped out and replaced with cold, wet cement. Hit that like and subscribe if you've ever been left out of something you thought you belonged to. Because what came next in my story wasn't revenge. It was something stronger, quieter, and far more lasting. To understand how I ended up on the outside looking in, you have to know what kind of daughter I was, and what kind of family I came from. I grew up in Ashford, Illinois, a mid-sized town where everyone knew which families had money and which didn't, and where it was clear from an early age that the Moores had enough money to matter. My father owned 3 hardware stores and a few rental properties around town, and my mother sat on the boards of every charity that had anything to do with the arts or the church. Appearances were everything to my parents, Mom in her pastel sweater sets and pearl earrings, Dad in his golf shirts and pressed khakis, always quick with a handshake and a pat on the back. From the outside, we were the picture of American stability. But inside that house, I learned early that love was conditional, and silence was the currency that kept things running smoothly. Nathan, being the firstborn son, was groomed for inheritance before he could spell it. He was 10 years older than me, and I used to watch him swagger around like he owned the place, because one day he would. My parents used to joke about it openly at dinner, and Nathan will run the stores, Dana will marry someone important, and Patricia, well, you've always had a big heart, sweetheart. That was my role, quiet, obedient, helpful Patricia, the daughter who didn't cause trouble, who could be counted on to clean up after everyone else. Dana, 2 years younger than me and already the family's princess, got away with everything. Skipping school, sneaking boys in, screaming tantrums that ended with Mom whispering comforts and blaming it all on teenage hormones. I got pats on the head and a chore list taped to the fridge. I don't remember the exact moment I decided that love in our house was something to earn, but I do remember the day I realized I would never get it the same way they did. I was 12 when I won a district writing competition, an essay on resilience that I'd stayed up 3 nights to perfect. I was so proud. I clutched that certificate all the way home from school, bouncing on my toes with excitement. When I showed it to my mother, she blinked, smiled politely, and said, "Oh well, that's nice, dear. Now can you set the table?" I did. I always did. That night, Dad toasted to Nathan getting a B+ in AP chemistry and called him our little scientist. No one mentioned my certificate. I folded it and tucked it under my mattress, where I kept other small victories that didn't make the family bulletin board. By the time I turned 20, I'd learned that the way to matter in my family was to be useful, not celebrated, not loved loudly, just useful. So I leaned into that role. When Mom slipped on the stairs and broke her ankle, I left college a semester early to help out. Just until she's back on her feet, I told my professors. That semester turned into a year. When Dad's blood pressure spiked and he needed someone to take him to appointments and manage his meds, I quit my job as a library assistant and moved back into my childhood bedroom. Dana was too busy with wedding planning. And Nathan he had the stores to run. It made sense, I told myself. I didn't have kids or husband or a mortgage. I was the logical choice. And I told myself, because I needed to believe it, that my parents saw me. That even if they didn't say it, they appreciated me. For nearly a decade, I played nurse, chauffeur, housekeeper, an emotional punching bag. I scheduled MRIs, picked up prescriptions, and cooked countless meals my mother refused to eat because they were too bland or too spicy or not what she asked for. My father would grunt from his recliner, barely acknowledging me except to bark about the volume on the TV. Still, I stayed. Even when the exhaustion seeped into my bones and my friends stopped inviting me out because I always had an excuse. Even when I watched the years tick by and realized I'd sacrificed the most vibrant chapter of my life to be their shadow. I stayed because I thought, surely, when the time came, they would remember. Surely, they would look at the ledger of my life and mark it with something other than indifference. The final years were the worst. Mom's cognition began slipping, not in dramatic, cinematic ways, but slowly, cruelly. She forgot names first, then dates, then how to dress herself properly. She'd call me the other one, and then chuckle like it was a joke. She mistook Dana for a nurse once, which was poetic in a bitter sort of way. Dad grew angrier the more helpless he became, lashing out at everyone, but mostly me, because I was always there. He once threw a spoon across the kitchen because I served his soup lukewarm. I mopped up the mess, swallowed the humiliation, and told myself it didn't mean anything. They were old. They were scared. I had to be the bigger person. The week my father died, I slept on the floor beside his bed for 5 straight nights. He'd gotten paranoid, wouldn't let anyone else near him. He kept muttering about protecting the Willie and not letting her get away with it, though he never said who he was. I thought he was hallucinating. Now I wonder. After he passed, the hospice nurse squeezed my hand and told me I was a good daughter. I cried for the first time in weeks, loud, heaving sobs that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with finally being seen. When Mom died 6 months later, more quietly, I was the one who brushed her hair and buttoned her favorite blouse before they took her away. Dana showed up an hour late with Starbucks. Nathan flew in that afternoon and went straight to the funeral home to talk logistics. No one asked me how I was doing. I didn't expect them to. So when the lawyer read the will, so matter-of-fact, so clean and final, it wasn't just the omission that gutted me. It was the smugness in Nathan's posture, the way Dana avoided eye contact. It was the dawning realization that this hadn't been a clerical error or a forgotten page. It had been the plan. All along. They'd known. Maybe even encouraged it. And suddenly, everything made a brutal kind of sense. All those years I'd spent serving, hoping, waiting for acknowledgement, none of it had mattered. Not to them. Not in the end. But I wasn't going to break. I had already given too much of myself to people who only saw me when they needed something. What followed wasn't revenge. I didn't scream or throw things or storm out of the office. Instead, I sat there, hands folded in my lap, and decided something quietly, firmly, inside my own bones. I would no longer be the ghost in their story. I would write my own. And it would begin not with what they took from me, but with what I chose to reclaim. I wasn't prepared for how heavy silence could feel once the caregiving stopped. After the funeral and the will and that sterile office with its smug conclusions, I returned to the house, not to grieve, not really, but because I didn't know where else to go. I'd spent 12 years in that house taking care of them. My name wasn't on the deed, and now I realized that had been deliberate too. They'd let me believe I was safe, that this home, our home, was a shared trust. But legally, I had no claim to it. Still, I went back that day, letting the familiar creak of the porch boards under my feet echo the hollowness inside me. The floral curtains Mom had sewn 30 years ago still hung in the kitchen. Her perfume lingered faintly in the hallway. My father's recliner sat untouched, a silent sentinel in front of the muted television. It felt like a museum curated by cruelty, each room a careful reminder of what I'd given and what they decided I wasn't worth. I didn't cry. I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, stared at the framed photo of the three of us, Dana, Nathan, and me, at my high school graduation, and just sat. I remember that day clearly. They'd come late, of course. Mum had scolded me for my choice of dress, too frumpy for a celebration, and Dad hadn't said a word except to ask when we could leave. Dana had flirted with one of my classmates, and Nathan had laughed when I tripped on the auditorium steps. Still, I had believed they cared. I had thought maybe they just didn't know how to show it. That if I kept trying, kept proving my worth, they'd meet me halfway. It's strange how much energy you can waste trying to interpret indifference as some complicated version of love. The day after the will reading, I woke to the sound of footsteps. I'd been sleeping lightly, my ears still trained for emergencies even though there were none left to manage. When I padded downstairs, Dana was standing in the living room with a clipboard, talking to a man I didn't recognize. "She's still here?" the man asked, as if I were mold he hadn't anticipated. Dana turned toward me with that brittle smile she wore when she was trying to seem nice while being anything but. "Trish," she said, using the nickname only she got away with. "This is Greg from the estate office. He's just helping us coordinate the house transfer." "What do you mean, house transfer?" I asked, heart thudding as the morning light suddenly felt too bright, too sharp. Dana didn't flinch. "It's all in Nathan's name now," as she said smoothly. "Mom and Dad updated the paperwork a year ago. We just didn't want to stress you with the details while they were still alive." The pause before the last word was deliberate, a stab disguised as pity. I wanted to scream. To remind her that while she was off at brunches and yoga retreats, I was the one cleaning their bedpans. That I was the one who had comforted them in the dark, who had listened to their regrets when no one else would come near. Instead, I stood there, arms crossed over my chest, and asked, "Erin, what happens to me?" Dana blinked, then sighed, as if I were being unreasonable. "Nathan's offering you a month to pack up. He wants to sell before the holidays." She looked at me like she was doing me a favor. Like I should be grateful for the grace period. I didn't respond. I simply turned, walked back upstairs, and closed the door behind me. I leaned against it, chest tight, and let my body tremble with the restraint I wouldn't let show in front of her. In that moment, something inside me hardened, not into bitterness, but into resolve. They had underestimated me for so long that they assumed I would shrink away quietly, like I always had. But something about being erased in such an orchestrated, cold-blooded way had burned away the last of my illusions. They didn't just forget me. They planned it. And they thought I wouldn't fight because I never had before. I began packing that afternoon, not because I was giving up the house, but because I knew I had to prepare. I boxed up old medical records, utility bills, photos. Not sentimental things, those could wait, but paper trails. My parents weren't as organized as they liked to believe. And I'd handled all their affairs for over a decade. I knew where everything was, the files under the bed, the receipts in the laundry room cabinet, the binder in the top shelf of the linen closet labeled "A More Family Legacy." It wasn't a dramatic discovery, but it was enough. Inside that binder were drafts of wills, handwritten notes, emails printed out from their lawyer. I saw my name in an earlier version, a full third of the estate left in my name. The newer ones were typed, cleaner, cold. My name vanished. But I had dates. I had evidence. I called the lawyer, Mr. Gibbons, and asked for a meeting. He sounded surprised. "There's nothing to discuss, Patricia," he said. "Everything was filed legally." "I'm not contesting the will," I replied, calm despite the tremor in my fingers. "I just have a few questions. About timelines. About when certain decisions were made." There was a pause, then a reluctant sigh. "I can give you 20 minutes tomorrow." Noon. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. Not because I felt secure, but because for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't waiting on someone else's needs. I wasn't trying to earn their affection. I was focused entirely on myself. The betrayal didn't paralyze me anymore. It clarified everything. At the meeting, Mr. Gibbons confirmed what I already knew. "Your mother changed the will in 2021, after your father had his first stroke. Nathan and Dana were named sole beneficiaries." No explanation was given. Was she fully cognizant then? I asked, watching his eyes carefully. "She passed the legal test," he said, though he didn't meet my gaze. "But she was declining." I advised against making such sweeping changes. "Did anyone else attend the meeting where the changes were signed?" I pressed. He hesitated, then finally muttered, "And Nathan was present." As a witness. Dana came later to sign some additional paperwork. So they had been there. Together. Behind my back. Strategizing while I was wiping drool from the corners of our father's mouth. I walked out of that meeting with my hands shaking and my heart strangely steady. It was all true, what I'd suspected in my worst moments. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was logistical, intentional, legal. But knowing it didn't crush me the way I feared it would. It cleared the air. They had made their moves. Now it was my turn. I didn't want their money. I didn't want the house. What I wanted was truth. And after so many years of silence, I was finally ready to speak. The kind of speaking that didn't involve raised voices or flung accusations, but the kind that radiated outwards, into friends, into neighbors, into the community that thought they knew who their good children were. The next few weeks became a kind of quiet reckoning. I began writing everything down. Not just the legal facts, but the memories. The caregiving years, the manipulations, the things they asked of me that no daughter should have been expected to give without acknowledgement. I didn't know yet what I would do with it, but writing gave shape to the years they had tried to erase. I became my own historian, refusing to let them control the record of what had really happened in that house. And then came the invitation. A charity gala in my mother's name, organised by Dana. She had sent the glossy cardstock invitation with a handwritten note. "I would love for you to attend, if you're in town. We're honouring her legacy. Hope you're doing okay. Love, D." Legacy. The word clawed at my throat. That was the moment I knew where the next chapter of my story would unfold. Not in court. Not in private. But in public. Among the smiling donors and half-sincere toasts. I didn't know exactly how I would say what needed to be said, but I knew that's where I would say it. Because if they thought they had written the final word on who Patricia Moore was, they hadn't been paying attention. I wasn't the family ghost anymore. I was finally stepping into the light. I didn't RSVP to Dana's gala. I didn't decline either. I let the invitation sit on my kitchen counter, unopened after that first furious skim, its embossed script gleaming under the kitchen light like some kind of cosmic dare. It was held at the Ashford Cultural Hall, my mother's old playground, the venue where she'd hosted countless fundraisers, tea luncheons, and seasonal auctions. The same place she used to parade Dana around as her little trophy, dressed in matching Easter pastels while I bussed tables in the back. The gala was marketed as a night to celebrate Clara Moore, a legacy of service. The irony was almost too thick to swallow. Still, I went, not to smile, not to forgive, but because some truths demand to be heard in the very rooms where the lies once thrived. I arrived alone, wearing a charcoal dress that didn't ask for attention but didn't shrink from it either. My hair was pinned up, my makeup clean and subdued. It wasn't vanity that drove my appearance that night, it was armor. Ashford was the kind of town that noticed things like lipstick and shoes, and I didn't want the whispers to be about how a Patricia really let herself go after they passed. I walked into that building with my chin high, not because I wasn't nervous, I was trembling under my skin, but because I'd spent too long bowing my head in rooms filled with people who thought they knew me. The cultural hall was already packed. Chandeliers glistened overhead, and the scent of white roses, my mother's favorite, hung in the air so thick it was nearly suffocating. Waiters in tuxedo vests floated through the crowd with flutes of champagne, and the sound of a string quartet mingled with idle chatter. I saw familiar faces, neighbours, old teachers, business associates of my father's. They smiled politely, then let their gazes slide over me as if trying to remember whether they were supposed to say something beyond a nice to see you. I didn't blame them. In this town, grief and legacy had always been tied to appearances, not substance. Dana stood near the front, flanked by a poster-sized photo of our mother in her younger years, gloved, coiffed, benevolent. Dana wore a gown that shimmered under the lights, her hair cascading in glossy waves. She looked exactly the part of the dutiful daughter, and as I approached, her expression shifted into something careful and practiced. "You came," she said, smiling like it was a favor. "I did," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "Wouldn't miss it." Nathan appeared beside her a second later, holding 2 glasses of champagne. He offered one to Dana, then gave me a once-over that bordered on patronizing. "Trish," he said, nodding. "Glad you could make it." "I'm not staying long," I said flatly. But I wanted to hear what's being said in Mom's name. Dana's smile twitched at the edges. "It's a celebration, not a tribunal." "I'm aware," I said. But she knew I wasn't just there to reminisce over canapés. I moved to a corner table near the back, alone, observing. The evening unfolded in polished segments, introductions, laughter, whispered gossip between wine sips. A woman from the local arts council made a speech about my mother's contributions to Ashford's cultural heritage. Someone else recalled her generous donations and tireless volunteering. Words like compassionate and unwavering echoed through the speakers, and I sat there, swallowing each one like a bitter pill. No one mentioned the private Clara Moore, the one who turned her back when I was sick, who belittled my dreams, who believed that duty was the only acceptable form of love. But the worst came next. Dana stepped up to the podium, bathed in soft light, her voice honeyed and rich with pretense. She was our guiding star, she began. And we, Nathan and I, feel so honored to carry her legacy forward through the Moore Foundation. There it was. The pivot. The reveal. They were launching a foundation. My mother's name now cemented into a non-profit with tax benefits and social clout. I could practically hear the donors reaching for their checkbooks. Through this foundation, Dana continued, it will support caregivers, women who dedicate their lives to helping others, just like her mother did. I nearly choked on my breath. My fingers clenched around the water glass, knuckles turning white. Caregivers. The word hit me like a slap. I was the caregiver. I had given 12 years, sacrificed my own life to care for that woman, and now they were draping that identity over her shoulders like a velvet cape. I stood up. Slowly. Deliberately. I walked toward the podium as Dana wrapped up her speech, thanking the crowd for their generosity. She didn't see me until I was nearly beside her. "Excuse me," I said into the microphone she was about to relinquish. "I won't take long." The room quieted instantly. Dana froze. Nathan shifted behind her, his jaw tightening. "My name is Patricia Moore," I said, voice shaking but steady. "I'm Clara's daughter. Her eldest living caregiver. Some of you may know me. Many of you don't. That's fine. But I can't sit here tonight and listen to stories that only tell half the truth." Murmurs swept across the room like a tide. I was the one who stayed, I continued. When Clara got sick. When our father forgot how to use the microwave. When no one else would show up. I wiped her face when she couldn't recognize her own. I held her hand when she screamed in the night. I heard her confusion, her anger, her silence. I bore witness to the parts of her that this room would never name. Dana stepped forward, trying to intervene, but I turned to face her. "Don't," I said quietly, and to her credit, or perhaps her calculation, she backed off. "This foundation you're all applauding," I said, returning to the crowd, it claims to honor caregivers. So let me tell you what caregiving really looks like. It looks like missed birthdays and cancelled jobs. It looks like sitting in a hospital corridor at 2 a.m. wondering if this is the night they won't come home. It looks like love so quiet and sacrificial that no one remembers to call it love at all. Silence. "I'm not here for applause," I said. "I'm here because stories matter. And this one, mine, was erased. I'm not asking you to change your minds about Clara Moore. I'm asking you to acknowledge that people like me exist. And that sometimes, the quietest ones carry the heaviest loads." I stepped down before the weight of emotion could betray me. I didn't look at Dana or Nathan. I walked out through the wide double doors, past the stunned silence and the orchestra still holding their instruments mid-air. Outside, the night was crisp and clear. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. That night didn't change everything, not in the fairy tale way people expect when the truth comes out. But it changed me. I had spoken. I had taken my place in the narrative. And I knew, even if no one else said it out loud, they had heard me. 3 days later, I got a call from a woman named Elise, who had attended the gala and worked at a caregiving advocacy network. She told me my words had moved her, that she, too, had cared for a parent and felt invisible. "We're building something," she said. "And I think you have something important to say." I didn't know then what I was stepping into. But I said yes. Because for the first time, someone had heard the truth and wanted to build from it, not bury it. The weeks after the gala were surreal, as if I had stepped sideways out of my life and into some alternate reality where people actually wanted to hear what I had to say. Elise connected me with her team, and suddenly I found myself speaking at small community centres, writing op-eds for local blogs, and even joining a virtual panel on family caregiving and invisible labour. The first time I saw my words quoted online, that caregivers are often erased not because they are unimportant, but because their love is quiet and inconvenient to celebrate, I stared at the screen for 20 minutes, unsure whether to cry or laugh. That was my sentence. My truth. And it was out there, reaching people I'd never met, never had to convince face-to-face that I mattered. But none of it changed the fact that I still had no home. After Nathan's month-long grace period expired, I moved into a modest two-bedroom apartment on the edge of Ashford. The walls were thin, and the plumbing groaned like it had its own grudges, but the space was mine. I hung up a few framed photographs, not family ones, but snapshots from hikes I'd taken during rare escapes, a faded picture of my college friends at Lake Geneva, and a postcard from a student I used to tutor. It was a beginning. Lonely, yes, but beginning all the same. Dana called once. It was early evening, and I was making lentil soup while listening to Nina Simone when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. But curiosity, or perhaps some lingering reflex of responsibility, made me swipe. "Patricia," as she said, voice unsure, a bit too soft. I stirred the soup. "Dana." I heard you've been speaking at events. About caregiving. Millimeter. I just wanted to check in. That made me laugh. Bitterly. "Check in?" She paused. "Look, I know things have been tense. But this isn't how it has to be." "No," I said, tasting the broth. "This is exactly how it has to be. Because this, what you're doing right now, is the first time in years you've called me without needing something." She didn't deny it. "You're angry." "I'm awake," I replied. "There's a difference." She stayed silent for a few seconds. "Mom loved you, you know." My grip on the spoon tightened. Then why erase me? Why rewrite everything we lived just to make a cleaner story? "It wasn't like that," as she said, too quickly. She was confused. And Nathan, he thought it would be simpler too. Simpler for who? I snapped, the first edge of anger cracking through. Simpler for the people who didn't lift a finger while I bathed her, changed her, kept her alive long after she stopped caring if she lived at all? Dana's voice wavered. "We didn't know how to help. You always made it seem like you had it under control. I had no choice. I'm sorry." And for a split second, I almost softened. Almost. But then I remembered the lawyer's office, the smirk, the will, the way she spoke of legacy like I had never existed. Not good enough, I said, and hung up. After that, I stopped hoping for anything from her. Or from Nathan. Or from any of them. And the strangest thing happened. I began to breathe easier. My work with Elise's network grew quickly. We launched a podcast, The Unseen Hours, where former caregivers shared their experiences. I recorded an episode about my parents, the years I lost, the things no one talks about, the resentment, the guilt, the bone-deep fatigue. It went viral within a week. Listeners sent emails. Messages poured in from strangers across the country. Some cried. Some raged. Some just said thank you. One message came from a woman named Delia in Arizona. Hearing you talk about folding your mom's cardigans after she forgot your name, that broke me. That was my life too. Thank you for saying it out loud. I read her words on a rainy Tuesday night, curled on my hammer-down couch with a mug of tea, and felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Not because the past had been fixed, but because it had finally been seen. Of course, not everyone was supportive. A few emails questioned my motives. One accused me of dancing on your family's grave. Another, likely from one of Dana's socialite friends, called me a selfish and ungrateful and accused me of exaggerating for attention. But those voices didn't stick. Not like they once would have. For the first time, I wasn't relying on other people's definitions to know who I was. And then, nearly 2 months after the gala, I received an envelope. Thick, formal, my name printed neatly on the front. Inside was an invitation to the Moore Foundation's second major event, a scholarship award ceremony for young women pursuing degrees in elder care and nursing. There was a note clipped to the back. Patricia, we would be honored if you would present the first scholarship. It is being named after you. Please consider attending. Your voice matters. Elise. I sat with that letter for hours. My first reaction was skepticism. Was this a performative gesture? A PR move? But no, Elise wasn't like that. She had fought beside me. And this wasn't from Dana or Nathan. This was from someone who had seen my struggle and decided that the way forward wasn't to erase me but to honor me. Still, the idea of standing again in front of a crowd, in the same town that had swallowed my silence for decades, filled me with more fear than I cared to admit. I called Elise. Are you sure about this? I asked. Her answer was immediate. You're the reason this scholarship exists. You didn't just tell your story, you built something from it. That's not just brave. It's historic. I don't know if I'm ready. You're more than ready. And deep down, I knew she was right. I'd spoken truth once and survived. I could do it again. But this time, I wasn't walking into a room to confront the past. I was stepping into one to claim the future. So I said yes. The night of the ceremony, I wore a navy suit. Simple, elegant, mine. The venue was smaller than the gala had been. Less glitz, more purpose. There were no grand chandeliers, just rows of folding chairs, a podium, and a screen that displayed a slideshow of the scholarship recipients with their stories. I stepped up to the microphone, hands trembling but voice clear. Good evening, I began. My name is Patricia Moore, and for a long time, I thought my story didn't matter. I believed that the love I gave was invisible because it wasn't rewarded, recorded, or written into any will. But tonight, I know that's not true. Because here you are. And here I am. There were tears in the audience. Mine among them. I'm proud to present the first More Caregiver Legacy Scholarship. Not because it carries my name, but because it carries the truth. That love, real love, is labor. And that labor deserves to be seen. Afterward, people lined up to speak to me. Some thanked me. Some simply hugged me. A few told me their own stories in rushed, tearful fragments. I took it all in. I held their hands. I listened. And when I went home that night, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel erased. I felt powerful. Because I hadn't just survived what they did to me. I had turned it into something that could never be undone. There's something no one tells you about finally being seen, about being recognized, not for showy success or popularity, but for endurance, for love that gave more than it ever received. That kind of recognition doesn't make you feel proud at first. It makes you feel exposed. Roar. As though someone has peeled back a layer of armor you didn't realize you were wearing, and suddenly the wind feels too sharp on your skin. That's how it felt for me after the scholarship ceremony. I went home that night, kicked off my shoes, and stood in the quiet of my apartment, uncertain of what to do with this new, unfamiliar kind of attention. It wasn't the pitying glances of family friends or the polite dismissals I had grown used to. It was something more startling, real admiration. And it scared me more than I wanted to admit. For weeks after the event, I kept waiting for something to go wrong. I told myself it was just a wave of goodwill, that soon people would forget again. That the emails from strangers would stop. That the podcast offers and panel invitations would dry up. But they didn't. Instead, things grew. A caregiving nonprofit in Chicago reached out to collaborate. A well-known journalist asked to interview me for a feature piece. And my episode on the unseen hours had now surpassed 100,000 listens. It was surreal. And yet, the most surprising thing wasn't any of that. It was how many people from Ashford, my own hometown, began reaching out. People I hadn't spoken to in years, old teachers, neighbors, even my high school guidance counselor, sent messages that began with hesitant admissions. I didn't know what you were going through, or I wish I had paid more attention. I told myself I didn't need their acknowledgement, but every time one came, I read it twice. Sometimes 3 times. Because part of me, the part that used to beg for scraps of attention from my family, was still healing. Slowly. Quietly. And then came the letter from Nathan. It arrived by mail, hand-addressed, the handwriting unmistakable. Inside was a single page of hotel stationery. Patricia, I heard about the scholarship. I watched your speech online. I don't know if you'll even want to read this, but I felt I had to say something. I didn't know the extent of what you went through. That's not an excuse, it's just the truth. I let myself believe that what we were doing with the will, with the foundation, was cleaner, easier. I see now that it was cruel. You deserved better. I can't undo what's been done, but I'm willing to talk, if you ever want to. Not as your brother, maybe, but as someone trying to understand what he got wrong. I hope you're well. Truly. N. I read it once and then tucked it into a drawer. I didn't respond. Not yet. I wasn't ready to decide whether his guilt was authentic or convenient. Whether this was the start of something honest or just damage control now that my story had reached more people than he expected. But I kept the letter. And that, I suppose, meant something. Dana, on the other hand, didn't write. Didn't call again either. But I heard she was quietly removed from the leadership board of the Moore Foundation after an internal vote. Elise never confirmed the reason, but I noticed Dana's name disappear from the website, and the next event they held, focused on equitable caregiving policies, featured speakers from across backgrounds, none of whom had last names that matched mine. It felt like a cleansing, not of spite, but of truth. They were finally building something real. Meanwhile, I kept going. I started a memoir, not because I thought I was extraordinary, but because I wanted to give shape to a story so many others shared but hadn't been able to tell. I began each chapter with a caregiving memory, mundane, often painful, sometimes darkly funny, and then unraveled what it meant. The kind of stories no one claps for, scraping dried soup off your mother's chin while she curses you for not being Dana, or silently Googling how to change adult diapers while pretending to be fine. One morning, while I was editing a chapter, I received a voicemail from a woman named Margaret, the director of the state's Elder Care Commission. She had listened to the podcast, read the profile, and wanted me to join a roundtable on reform policy. "We need people like you," as she said. Not just professionals with degrees, but people who lived it. People who understand the cost. It was the first time anyone had referred to those years with the word cost, and it made my breath catch. Yes. It had cost me. And I had paid, over and over. In time. In health. In opportunities. In dreams I didn't even get the chance to articulate before setting them aside. But now, those debts were being converted into something that helped others. My loss was becoming someone else's gain. And somehow, that made it feel less like loss. Still, the past doesn't stay neatly buried. One evening, I stopped by the Ashford Cemetery. I hadn't been back since the double funeral. I wasn't sure why I went, maybe to test myself. Maybe to see if I could stand there without flinching. The air was cool, the ground freshly cut around the newer headstones. My parents' shared marker sat in polished grey granite, their names engraved in looping cursive. There were fresh flowers on the base, probably from Dana, who still visited when it was convenient for her narrative. I knelt beside the stone, not to pray, but to speak. "I hope you know what I did with the years you took from me," I whispered. "I hope you understand what it cost." I didn't expect a sign or some poetic gust of wind. But as I stood up and brushed the grass from my knees, a strange thing happened. I felt nothing. No anger. No grief. Just space. And in that space, there was room for me to breathe. On the way out of the cemetery, I ran into Mrs. Eldridge, my old neighbor. She clutched her walker and smiled at me. "Your mother used to brag about Dana," as she said with a twinkle. "But you're the one people talk about now." I smiled politely, then walked away, her words echoing behind me. That night, I opened Nathan's letter again. Reread it. This time, I wrote something back. "Dear Nathan, you're right. You can't undo it. But I believe people can change. I don't need you to validate my story. I've already done that. But if you want to understand, really understand, what those years were like, I'm willing to talk. On my terms. Patricia. I didn't know what that conversation would look like. But I knew I wasn't afraid of it. Because now, I wasn't speaking for survival. I was speaking from power. When Nathan arrived at the cafe the following Saturday, he looked older than I remembered. Not in the obvious ways, his hair still neat, his clothes sharp, but in the small signs that only a sibling would notice. The slight droop in his posture. The wary hesitation behind his eyes. He spotted me at the back table and offered a nervous half-smile, the kind you give when you're unsure if you'll be welcomed or sent away. I didn't stand. I didn't smile. I just gestured to the seat across from me. He sat down slowly, setting his phone face down on the table like it might accuse him of something. For a long moment, we didn't speak. The murmur of the cafe filled the space between us, coffee machines hissing, silverware clinking, soft jazz humming through the overhead speakers. I wasn't sure you'd show, I said finally. I wasn't sure you'd answer, he replied. Touché. I studied him as he fiddled with the corner of a sugar packet. For years, I tried to read Nathan, to decode his silences and shrugs, to understand how the same parents who raised me could raise someone so seemingly untouched by duty or grief. But now, I didn't need answers. I just needed honesty. I read your letter, I said. I appreciated it. He nodded, swallowing hard. I meant every word. Even the part where you said you didn't know what I was going through? I asked. Because you did know. Maybe not every detail, but enough to understand that I was drowning and no one threw me a rope. Nathan looked down. You're right. I knew more than I let on. I told myself you could handle it. That you didn't need help. But that was cowardice, not trust. I let that sit for a while. I didn't let him off the hook. But I didn't twist the knife either. I didn't need you to fix everything, I said. I just needed someone to see me. He nodded again. And I didn't. I'm sorry. That word, it always lands differently depending on who says it. From Dana, it would have sounded performative, laced with excuses. But from Nathan, in that moment, it was quiet and raw. And most importantly, it was unaccompanied by any justification. I still don't understand why you left me out of the will, I said, not as an accusation, but as a truth that needed oxygen. He exhaled slowly. Because I didn't want to fight. I wanted everything simple, clean. And when Mom proposed the changes, I didn't argue. I should have. But by then, it had become easier to go along with what she wanted than to challenge the narrative. And that narrative was that Dana was the princess, you were the heir, and I was, what? The live-in maid? He flinched, but didn't deny it. I stared out the window, watching two kids chasing each other across the sidewalk. You know what hurts the most? It's not the money. It's not even the house. It's that no one stopped to ask why I gave up. No one ever said thank you. Nathan's voice cracked. Thank you. It was too late, in one sense. And yet, somehow, not too late at all. I'm not here to fix the past, I said, turning back to him. I'm building something now. And you're welcome to be a part of it, if you're willing to do the work. What does that look like? He asked, genuinely. It looks like showing up, I said. It looks like listening. It looks like using your position to make things right, not just with me, but with every unseen caregiver whose story never made it into the will, or the obituary, or the gala program. Nathan sat with that. Let it wash over him. And then, quietly, he said, okay. I want to try. For the first time in years, I believed him. That spring, we began collaborating. Carefully. Uneasily at first. He started attending more foundation events, not as a figurehead, but as a learner. He stepped back from leadership and let the community guide the work. When the foundation announced a new initiative, funding respite care for single caregivers, he offered to handle logistics, defer recognition. And when a major donor tried to redirect the funds toward a more marketable program, Nathan backed me, unequivocally. It didn't make us close again. Not like when we were kids, sneaking into the attic to avoid chores, or playing cards under the dining room table during long parties. That version of us was gone. But in its place, something sturdier took root: mutual respect. Earned, not assumed. Dana never reached out again. I saw her once, briefly, at a city fundraiser. She was dressed impeccably, laughing with a circle of acquaintances, her face the same mask of charm I remembered. When she saw me, her expression faltered, just for a second, and then smoothed back into neutrality. We didn't speak. And I didn't need to. Because by then, I no longer required her acknowledgement to know my worth. The memoir was published in the fall under the title The Weight No One Sees. It didn't become a bestseller overnight, but it found its people, the daughters, sons, spouses, and neighbors who had carried the invisible burdens of love. The email inbox I set up for reader letters overflowed within weeks. One message, from a man in Vermont, simply read, "You put into words what I've never been able to say to my own siblings. Thank you for making me feel seen." That was the only kind of legacy I needed. Months later, on what would have been my mother's birthday, I held a small event at the Ashford Library. Not a memorial. A gathering. There were readings, a panel, and a shared potluck of home-cooked meals, the kind I used to make while no one else was watching. I opened the event with a short speech. We were taught to believe that love only matters when it's celebrated, I said. But sometimes, the deepest love is the one that goes unseen. Tonight, we're honoring the love that shows up anyway. As I stepped down, I noticed Elise in the back, smiling through tears. Nathan stood beside her, arms crossed but soft-eyed. The room felt warm. Full. Not of ghosts, but of gratitude. I left the library that night and walked home slowly under the stars. The street was quiet, the air cool, and for the first time in a long time, I felt not like I was walking away from something, but toward it. To anyone who's ever been written out, overlooked, or silenced, your story still matters. You still matter. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the one who stayed, who gave, who loved in the shadows, don't forget to like and subscribe. And share it with someone who needs to remember, being left out doesn't mean you weren't the heart of it all along. Thank you for listening to my story.